So we are now in our third and final panel for the day, just separating us from a dinner at 6:45. There will be transportation, so just heads up. So the title of this one is Beautiful Bridges from Paradise Gardens to Offshore Winds in the Indian Ocean. We have about 90 minutes, so I'll ask our dear panelists for maybe 20 minutes talks. Then I will give some of my comments, and then we will have a discussion, about 30 minutes discussion. First, I would like to introduce our wonderful speakers. So first we have Professor Nader Ardalan, who is an architect of Ardalan Associates, consultants in architecture and planning. He holds a master's in architecture from the Graduate School of Design of Harvard University, and he is a prolific author. So to be brief, one example that he co-edited more recently is Gulf Sustainable Urbanism, published by HBK Press in 2018. And he has been a visiting professor of design at Harvard, Yale, MIT, and Tehran University. Dr. Ardalan will tell us about the diffusion of the Paradise Gardens paradigm in the Indian Ocean. Then we have Dr. Prakash Kashwan, who is an associate professor of environmental studies at Brandeis University and also a political scientist. And he is also a prolific writer, and I'm going to be brief. His latest book just came out this year, Decolonizing Environmentalism with Bloomsbury. Dr. Kashwan is also the current chair of Environmental Studies section of the International Studies Association, ISA, and shout out, I'm also part of it, so that's of the theory section, but yeah, this is, I guess, our organization. And Dr. Kashwan will tell us about solar geoengineering in an unequal world, so delicate ecologies and precarious economies of monsoon-dependent regions of the Indian Ocean. I am Zainab El-Barnoussi, Associate Professor of Political Science here at the Africa Institute. I go by Z because it's easy, and I am moderating this session. So please, I want to give the floor to Professor Ardalan.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Nader Ardalan. It really is with great pleasure and appreciation to the Africa Institute for inviting me to be with you tonight. The title of my talk is Diffusion of the Paradise Garden Paradigm in the Indian Ocean Rim. But first, a short observation, a small digression. For the past 5 decades, the focus of my collaborative work and research studies has been the Persian Gulf. And I know that since I'm in the UAE, I've been sort of tutored that I would say the Gulf. And it's a small section of the Indian Ocean Rim, but I've had the pleasure of living here, working here, building here, teaching here, and really enjoying this life. And the interesting is that it's almost the same latitude as where we are today. It has a lot in common with this area. What I mean about the commonness is that I now live in Naples, Florida, which is also about the same latitude and on water as you are. One of my most recent publications is entitled The Gulf Sustainable Urbanism. sponsored by Qatar Foundation. It provided me the unique opportunity, and this is my point of digression, of course, of coming to know and collaborate with this wonderful Professor Rogaya Abu Sharaf, who I had the pleasure of collaborating over 3 years in the work that we did in the Persian Gulf. So we studied 8 countries, from Qatar up to Iraq, to Basra, and to Bandar Abbas, and then up into Kuwait, and then down to studies in Saudi Arabia, and in Bahrain, and in Abu Dhabi. It provided me the unique opportunity of coming to know a lot about this area, and really 7,000 years of history of what has been called the cradle of civilization. What I want to say is that studies were very multidisciplinary, from urban form and architecture. How did those things survive? And with distinction. And environment and public health from the School of Public Health at Harvard, and sociocultural and economic, anthropological. And our first year of work was about the past. That first year lasted actually 3 years, and we never got the beautiful chance of going on into the present or into the future, although in my own thoughts I have done that. But it gave us a very much interesting opportunity of looking at a culture that really existed in an environment that was very sparse and very demanding. High heat, almost very little amount of available materials, and the fact that it survived by the ocean, and it survived by the trade of the oceans. What I learned about survival was that nature is extremely brutal. There are only 3 rules. You adapt to survive, or you migrate to a new environment to survive, or you go into extinction, wherever that takes you, whatever environment that is. And I may be talking about paradise tonight. And the sustainability rules, findings from these 7,000 years of looking at the buildings, the culture, the people, was interdependency, self-sufficiency, flexibility, adaptive eco-technology, compactness, courtyard housing, proximity inclusion, cultural traditions, and spiritual ethics, something that we'll talk about toward the end of this talk. So it's broken into 3 parts. The first part, we're going to sort of begin by looking at man, woman, child, beaming into the wonderment of the skies. And what did they do? So here is some tile design from 8th century Luristan in Persia, now in the British Museum, very safekeeping place. And what did they do? They first envisioned a great wheel of the solar zodiac, of the order of the zodiac, of the movement of the solar systems. And the next thing, which I'll speak about more, and it really is the theme of the talk, is the 4-quartered universe and the garden. Well, really, Gilgamesh writings from the Persian Gulf talk about this idea of paradise and a garden. We don't have any memories. We don't really have any remnants of it. But we do have the Assyrian king feasting in his royal garden from 7th century, once again in the British Museum, of course. But nothing really substantial of it has remained for us other than this mythology. But fortunately, I can say with great pride that the Paradise Garden, whose etymology originates from ancient Persia, derived from the Old Persian paradesa, walled enclosure or enclosed garden. These Persian gardens were more than ornamental. They held deep symbolic and spiritual significance, representing the cosmos and divine order characterized by this four-quarter division known as the Chahar Bagh. Bagh, garden, Chahar, four. And Greek historian Xenophon introduced the term paradeiso, describing the lush gardens and hunting parks of later Achaemenid kings in 401. That too we have no remnant of, but I have the pleasure to say, and here, in drawings by David Stronach, a wonderful man from the British Institute that I knew in Tehran, and he described the royal gardens of Pasargadae, and what were they? They were the palace garden of Cyrus the Great, the first dynastic capital of the Achaemenid Empire. And so we're looking at 500 BC, and I actually walked those channels, and the stone channels that irrigated this garden still exist, and they were cut by Ionian stonemasons. And a sort of a simulation of that garden you see here. Now, of course, how were you able to do this in the hot, arid desert climates of most of Persia? Well, ancient adaptive technologies. I'm sure this is something you all know. It's the concept of the qanat, or the khariz, one of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So you tap the main water source, and you bring it down, and you have shafts that go down that create these wonderful channels that you see here. And you cover them with these little ant holes. And what those ant holes are is that people going down periodically have to clean that channel, and the earth comes up and piles up like little ant hills. And of course, the qanat then spread west to Arabia, to North Africa, which is the subject of our conversation, to the lovely lady from Morocco, who's our host tonight, and on to Spain and Americas, and then eastward, really through the Silk Route to China, where we find these qanats, and also, of course, to Afghanistan, India, Pakistan. And it's the theme of being able to bring this water and then have it come out and create this kind of lush, lovely garden, such as the Bagh-e-Shazdeh in Mahan, in Kerman, Iran. Now, the concept of the garden is very much related also to the idea of the hidden and the manifest. Zahir, batin, hidden deep within, Zahir, outwardly. Outwardly, normally, the walled garden is like this one. The walls are around, but the garden at the center normally has a pavilion. And either it's a place of the royalty, or it's a place of the resting of the human soul. And it moves out through these 4 water channels normally, and irrigates these gardens. Or it's the batin, it's the hidden deep within us. What is that? Well, it's the spirit. And that spirit is sought through our soul. And what are the souls? They're really these running streams. Now, as you know, these streams and this 4-quartered world was seen by the Prophet Muhammad in his ascension to heaven. And he came back and he said there were 4 channels, one of water, one of milk, one of wine, and one essentially that dealt with sweetness. These kind of things became in time and transformed the Paradise Garden into the Islamic garden. And we'll trace that in the quick views we have. So here in the bottom you have the Bagh-e-Shazde that we saw, and there in Kashan you have the courtyard with the spirit of the water at the very center. But it grew only in time and developed its highest beauty in the Safavid period, really in the 16th, 17th century, with the growth of the city of Esfahan. And here you see one Chaharbagh and the plan and the entire city that was developed as a series of gardens. Most beautiful is really the royal gardens, the Dolat Khane. And here you have the Maidan-e-Shah, the sort of the great square, another four-quarter division that then leads to the palace grounds. And it's very interesting because there are really four major gateways, just for a digression. There's one to the authority. There's one to your religion. Then there's one to your mystical soul. And then the other is to your commercial self, the bazaar. Four basic structures. And when you go into the Dolat Khane, into the government palace grounds, you find these lovely gardens, many of them, such as the Chehel Sutun. Chehel, 40, but you only see 20 columns. But their reflection in the mirror pool. The idea of so as above, so as below. Very important. I'm an architect, and so when I was commissioned in 1972 to design the Iran Center for Management Studies with Harvard Business School, I designed, of course, a Chaharbagh, a paradise garden. And at the center is the library, the place of knowledge, gateways, student and faculty courtyards around, and at the end, the meeting, places of meeting, the case study method. And then, of course, the trees. These are interesting. I learned from the gardeners that you first design and place poplar trees because they grow fast. And beside each one, you grow a sarv. You do a long, slow-growing tree that lasts longer. And of course, it's very interesting. This is 72 on the left, and then there was a change in administration, if I could call. And so Iran became a place in which the school of Harvard Business School became the Imam Sadegh University, which trains the diplomatic corps of the Iranian government. But lo and behold, they said, this is my garden. They kept this garden. They enhanced this garden. So it shows the perennial aspects of certain myths and studies and symbols. That's the symbol. Walled garden, 4 parts, center, and it's very important that it has a center, because that's the sense of unity. And then all of these are blossomed, lively, because they're given fruit and life and water. But the soul of this place is centered on that center point where water comes in. Okay, that's the origins of this thing quickly, and it's diffusion. Diffusion through, of course, lands of the Persian Empire into neighboring Turkey, and then on into North Africa, into Spain, and then some of it into even America. And east to our neighbor Mughal India, and then through the workings of different lands to Southeast Asia. And so this research that I did was very interesting to find how much of that original four-quartered garden survived in various parts. Well, it survived very cleanly in Alhambra, in Spain, and even here in the Chaharbagh of the Court of the Lions. But it was Babur who sought refuge with the Timurid Empire of the Safavids. And there, this friendship allowed him to also come to know and love this kind of garden. And then when he conquered and went back, he built in Afghanistan the Bagh-e-Wafa, the Bagh-e-Felicity. And of course, this flourished beautifully in India. More land, more water, more possibilities of humidity. And so it culminated in the Taj Mahal in Agra. And the garden is there. All the same forms. And it moved further to Shalimar Gardens. Again, it was designed and administered by Ali Mardan Khan. And so with him, he brought certain plants, certain flowering aromatic plants. And the plan, again, is the four-quartered universe. Now, as I mentioned, as it moved further and further into Islamic cultures, the garden became the Islamic garden. And it moved until we now speak as island nations surrounded by a through floor of water and ideas, traveling from the Pacific Ocean to the Indian Ocean, Pacific being higher level, Indian lower level. But what is important is the flowing quality. And this flowing quality dealt more or less with the nature of spiritual beliefs in Southeast Asia, which exhibit a mixture of indigenous animistic, Taoist, Buddhist, Hindu, Sufi, and European colonial belief systems that is characterized by the fluidity of water. More beautiful, the Islamic garden in Java, since you vast area, you have to more or less deal with case studies. So most of my case study that I'll show you will be in Java and in Bali particular. But I'm interested in the inventions. The Subak irrigation system as a manifestation of the Trihita Karana philosophy. Here's where East meets West. And these rice-growing methodologies, about 15 of these major systems in Bali, but each starts where the mother spring well comes out, and that is where you create your garden. But it's interesting, Balinese three-courtyard Hindu temple plan, that's because we're such close neighbors. We feel so much with the same idea of the mandala, with the geometry. And so you have walls, and then you have courtyards, and you have gateways. But here, the gateways mainly oriented to sacred mountains. And then, of course, the water, the purification. In this particular one, the Puratrita and Pura Hindu temple, one of the main water courtyards in Bali. But I want to also say, it's not in the buildings, it's in the mind. So here's a simple offering by the simplest household every day, whether it's in geometric form like this or another, there is this offering. But this particular one is also related to the four quarters, and each of the quarters is given a certain color, and normally a certain flower is chosen to represent that color and that direction. My wife and I had an unbelievable experience of being invited by the Aga Khan Architecture Award, of which I was the steering committee. And we held our first meetings outside of Boston in Indonesia, in Jakarta. And someone who's wonderful, it's what you have in these sessions, said, Nadir, do you know that a long-delayed 100-year cleansing celebration that has been delayed is now going to be performed on March 31st, 1979. And if you can get there, you could actually participate in those celebrations. And so my wife and I, we put on our sarongs and off we went. And it was unbelievable. But there you go again. Every one of those is a geometrically organized offering. It's in the mind, it's in your ethic of how you look and how you design. This idea, beautifully shown in the cosmological axis of Yogyakarta, that points directly toward Mount Merapi in Java, that was built and designed in 1755 by the Sultan. And the axis runs from the axis of where the royal gardens are all the way through the main spine of the city, and all the major elements that make a city are aligned to this major axis. Where you shop, where you buy this, where you do that. And in this wonderful concoction, there is the Tamam Sarai. This is also a royal garden. And if you look at this plan, and I'm sorry that it's small, but there you have a chaharbagh on the bottom, four-quarter, and you have also the theme of the pavilion in the center of the garden where the Sultan would live. Curious though, on the left you see a circle. I'm an architect caught by geometry, so I want to say this to you. Clifford Geertz, who went with his wife to Bali in the 60s, that's wonderful archaeologist who can bear living in a little house and not doing very much for a number of years, but looking, listening, documenting, and then writing. Clifford Geertz told us that one of the aspects about government of this society is that it's a ritual, it's a performance, it's a dance. And the Sultan has to dance to be a good leader. This is what caught my attention. You see this picture of these steps, and it happened to be that this particular person was in the center of this platform. But look, nobody drew this plan, but it ignited me. So this is a circular mosque, and it has 5 stairs. And this mosque, first of all, is built half in water, half out of the water. And you can have stairs that bring you from the upper level, which is in the back of that person, and it goes again into the 4 directions. And one of them then goes down to the lowest, and that's where the mihrab is, pointing toward Mecca. But look at this. The Sultan is said that he went to this center, and that is where he meditated. And his entourage aligned all this upper gallery, and his musicians were on the lower gallery. And so there was this performance. And once he had finished his meditation, all the chanting and music, and the gongs would go on, and people would then celebrate looking into the sky in the day or the zodiac at night. That's a paradise. But paradise is endangered. So saving paradise, and many of us have been dealing about saving paradise. So case study Java sea rise and multiple pollution issues. IPCC says that by 2050, with different levels of emission of CO2, highest emission, 1 meter nearly to 2 meters sea rise, or low emission, good luck, 10 centimeters to 25 centimeters rise. However, even 1 meter of sea rise would profoundly affect the coastal life of Java, and Java, particularly its capital in Jakarta, has the issue of not only sea rise, but of land subsistence. Land subsistence because people have been digging wells, and there's no real major system for the pollution of the water. And so you dig wells, and you take up the subsistence of the land, and it submerges. And so this is intensifying to a level that already the government of Indonesia is building a new capital in Borneo. However, there are these national plans proposed to save Java by building massive seawalls as a solution. This is where we have these technocratic solutions, to use my colleagues' terms, that risk triggering populist cultural backlash. The engineering that brings walls to save, theoretically, you physically, but visually disconnecting you from water, the soul of how this society lives and is born. So, we have microplastics too. Plastics, and theoretically, we had actually a global plastics treaty meeting only a week ago, in which they came to no resolution. The same with regards to the issue of fossil fuels, because man has a problem of attitude. Once you live with such an attitude that you have to survive materially only, and you have no concerns of how you survive spiritually, you're going to wind up with these kind of problems. So the last president of Indonesia, we want to build a new Indonesia, a new work ethic, a new mindset, a new green economy. Islamic green Islam to the rescue. Well, it may be, and here's this wonderful book, one of the books written by Clifford Geertz called Islam Observed. There is a very scholarly, lovely journal that in 2023 wrote an article called Firecrackers, Geertz and Green Islam. This paper intends to examine the theory of his religious congruence from Clifford Geertz, parenthesis, which, whether we realize it or not, has become the basic assumption of green Islam discourse to form entirely friendly behavior among the Ummah. It quotes also my wonderful friend and very early mentor, Sayyid Hussein Nasr. Sayyid Hussein Nasr, in this article, says, it highlights the impact of European colonialism, exploitation and disruption of indigenous practices. A fundamental shift in worldviews occurred. 17th, 18th century, mainly as it went from the Renaissance thinking, as it was philosophically and I would say intellectually developed in Britain, in observations by scholars, that somehow developed this business of empiricism. Life and reality is by empirical knowledge. None of this Sufi business, none of this mystical business. So this shift in worldview, shift from this syncretic Muslim beliefs to empiricist Western views, this shift resulted in nature's desacralization and a mindset of environmental domination, man over nature rather than man and nature. In fact, supportive thinkers, not only Nasr, but many supportive thinkers from the Islamic world write, you must advocate for humanity's role as ethical stewards of the earth to avoid environmental degradation. The concept of treading lightly on the earth is promoted as the key to restoring ecological balance. Key to restoring ecological balance, the link between stewardship to trusteeship to security of the earth, both physically and spiritually. One of the books, The Garden of Truth by Nasr. But it's good that we don't get too faint-hearted about all this. Panama's study challenged this notion of Islamic congruence. From an ecological point, firecrackers, explosions during, can you imagine, Ramadan and Eid al-Fitr, particularly in Java, particularly causing environmental pollution and noise disturbance during holy rituals. Is this, what's the problem? Well, these examples seem to contradict the earth-friendly ecological principles of Green Islam. Do they demonstrate existence of incongruence within the movement? So they admonish, don't focus only on the beneficial effects of religion on the environment. Also examine human incongruence embedded in these actions, and they may negate or strengthen these particular religious roles. I go back to Java, I go back to Bali. The Trihita Karana, not developed through Islam, but a core Balinese philosophy rooted in Hindu cosmology. We find a complementary and supportive life ethics that emphasizes harmony in three ways: human to the divine, or the absolute as you wish, human to human, and human to nature. Three causes of well-being guides various aspects of Balinese life, from daily rituals, community cooperation, and environmental practice. These are lessons. This philosophy is reflected in the Subak system that I showed, an integral approach to water management, agriculture, social structure, and spirituality. Trihita Karana embodies the Balinese commitment to balance prosperity, shaping their cultural identity and sustainable practices. So, observation. While originating from diverse cultural contexts, the Trihita Karana philosophy, the Quranic Al-Firdaus, the Paradise Garden, and the Paradise Garden paradigm all emphasize the delicate balance between humanity, nature, and the absolute. By weaving these timeless insights into modern ecological urbanism, Javanese societies may forge a path towards environmental equilibrium. This fusion of spiritual depth and eco-sensitive scientific progress, aligned with UN sustainability goals, offers a blueprint of collective action against climate change, rooted in holistic harmony. With your permission, I want you to envision a future. Envision a world where ancient wisdom illuminates our path to a sustainable future. By embracing the spiritual essence of congruence, interconnectedness, and ethical stewardship, we unlock the potential to reshape our relationship with nature. Imagine cities transformed into paradise gardens, where urban design harmonizes with the planet's rhythms, and equity informs governance. Picture architecture inspired by the fluidity of liminal spaces, adapting naturally to the complex challenges of our place and time. In this visionary landscape, the boundaries between human innovation and natural processes blur, giving rise to solutions that dance on the edge of possibility. Climate change becomes an opportunity for creative co-evolution with the environment. Deep understanding of liminal concepts like barzakh in the Muslim faith, particularly I refer you to Ibn Arabi's writing on this idea of the liminal aspect of this sort of transcendence. And sunyata, the idea of nothingness, in weaving the syncretic culture into Buddhism and tapestry, offering a rich vocabulary for navigating the transition of potentialities of modern life unfolding and surviving. So as we embrace these ancient ideas with fresh eyes, we open doors to innovative eco-technologies, building with the ecology, not technologies that fight technology or dominate technology, crafting a world where humanity and nature might thrive in beautiful synchronicity. And of course, being a Persian, I have to end with a poem. And I love the poem that was given before by our Seychelles person. It's called The Truth Within Us. 'Twas a fair orchard full of trees, fruit, vines, and greenery. A Sufi there sat with eyes closed, his head upon his knee, sunk deep in meditation mystical. Why, asked another, dost thou not behold these signs of God the merciful displayed around thee, which he bids us to contemplate? A question. The signs, he replied, I hold within. Without is naught but symbols of the signs. You all know Rumi's wonderful poem. Thank you.
I want to really take you from the paradise on the ground to the real paradise. And I mean literally. So we are talking about solar geoengineering, which relates to the upper stratosphere. So I'm really taking you to the literal paradise, going from the paradise on ground. So this is the underlying framework that I'll follow in the talk, even though the structure of the talk is not necessarily follows the outline here. But we know about the climate crisis and scientific responses, the kind of techno-scientific imageries, for example, the Anthropocene, that have come to dominate the discussions of climate action. And then I'll take you through some discussions of political economy and how it shapes policy responses. And then finally ending with a discussion of what kind of implications proposals like solar geoengineering have for interconnected ecologies and precarious livelihoods in the times of vulgar inequalities. That's the context within which all of this is unfolding, the so-called polycrisis, right? So this audience doesn't have to be told about the climate crisis and its seriousness. As you would know, it has the actual climate crisis and its manifestation has actually exceeded the predictions that the scientists have been making, right? So Even though parts of the global north is busy fighting arguments about whether climate change is real or not, the actual manifestation has been worse than the scientific predictions. So instead of being serious about addressing the root causes of climate crisis, there is a group of climate scientists who are focusing on controversial technologies such as solar geoengineering to address the symptoms of the problems rather than tackling the root causes of climate crisis. And just as a reminder, I won't get into the details of this figure, but the first diagram here shows you that if you address fossil fuel emissions, you reduce your emissions directly based on the reduction of fossil fuel consumption, you don't have to do all of the other stuff that is being proposed, such as taking forest and land away from communities and putting them in the form of carbon farms and so forth, right? So the less successful you are in addressing the emissions, the more scary things, more environmentally and socially harmful things we are required to do. And now we are at a stage where it is almost assumed that we have failed to respond to climate change, and so we must do climate geoengineering because it's a responsibility. Because it's a responsibility of repairing the climate, and sometimes people even make arguments about justice, as if doing climate geoengineering is part of doing justice to the poorest people of the world. So within solar climate geoengineering, there are two different kinds of geoengineering that people often talk about, the solar geoengineering and the terrestrial geoengineering. The terrestrial geoengineering relate to carbon removal and carbon sequestration, forest-based or land-based storage of carbon that has been taken out of the atmosphere. I'll focus mainly on solar geoengineering. Within solar geoengineering, there's a bunch of different technologies. Most of them have localized effects. I will talk about what you see in the upper right corner, which is the idea of spraying sulfur dioxide or sulfuric acid in the upper stratosphere. And this is to mimic the effects of large-scale volcanic eruptions, which, when it spews out all that stuff, it has a lot of sulfur dioxide. It goes up in the upper stratosphere, and it actually prevents part of the sun rays from entering the Earth's atmosphere, and that cools it down. So even though you are living under a dark, polluted sky, you don't get as much sunlight, so you are kind of, not warming as much. So that's the idea of solar geoengineering as it is being proposed. And the scientists are right now working on the designs of airplanes that will take all that sulfuric acid and spray it up in the upper stratosphere so that you can live under a dark, polluted sky, which is cooler than it would be in the absence of these interventions. So this used to be like a sci-fi proposal, but it is increasingly part of the UNFCCC, the global climate negotiations, and there are real discussions. I was brought into this discussion when the American University created a group of global governance experts to talk about the governance of solar geoengineering, and that was in 2016. And between 2016 and 2024, people have skipped over the governance part, and they've started saying, let's just do it. We can't do the governance, let's just do geoengineering. So as you can imagine, I'm not a fan of governance anymore because we tried that and nobody was really interested in it. It seems that was kind of a smoke screen to bring the conversation into the mainstream and then put it up on the global governance radar or the forums of global climate governance. So I want to take a moment here to say that this is not going to be an argument about science versus humanity. Often you will hear people say, well, all the data is good, but there's also emotions, there's also like passion, there's also anger, there's also exploitation. I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is that, yes, let's actually look at the data. Let's actually look at the science. And if you're being selective about science, you can actually come up with findings that are not representative of the actual science. Right? So this is not a science versus society argument, but it's an argument about science in society or science that speaks to the society. So the first part here is to sort of look at the climate scientists who have actually studied the modeling studies and all kinds of meta studies, and they've identified 15 things that we don't know. And out of those, 20 things that we don't know, and there are things like unknown unknowns and known unknowns. And climate geoengineering is full of unknown unknowns. And that's because you can do all the modeling you want to do on the computers, but when you use those ideas and actually do it in the upper stratosphere, because we don't live in upper stratosphere, we don't know how the stratosphere is going to react, right? So those are unknown unknowns, and there are a bunch of them, and you can look at these research. So one of the biggest known impacts of solar geoengineering is going to be on the monsoons. And as you would know, monsoons are driven by the differences in temperature gradient between the ocean and the land, right? So you have, because of the differences, there's migration of evaporated moisture from the oceans, they form the cloud, and it rains, right? And solar geoengineering, by definition, we don't have to get into justice part as yet, but by definition, it changes the temperature gradient over landmass. And by doing that, by definition, by science, basic science, it's going to interrupt the monsoons. And so the monsoons, as we don't have to talk about that in this region. There are some studies that suggest that 1/3 of the global population depends on monsoons for their drinking water needs and their agriculture needs, and how much of rain-fed agriculture there is. Monsoons are also one of the tipping points where you have these climate impacts, and there are large-scale irreversible effects on these major systems, and that have major social consequences. Recently, we've heard about the Gulf Stream collapse, and that's again going to interfere with the monsoons. And I can guarantee you, within a month or two, you will see an argument saying that because Gulf Stream is screwing up monsoons, let's do solar geoengineering, because I can counter one screw up with another screw up. That's the sort of the argument, because I've seen these arguments being made in a variety of different contexts. There is quite a bit of discussion, there's quite a bit of momentum, there's some critical voices, but again, this is a sense of false equivalency, because the climate scientists who are advocates, of climate geoengineering, they have much more power compared to the critical social scientists who are brought in as an afterthought, as a sort of add-on to the mainstream discussions of solar geoengineering. And then you have media. So for this piece, for example, many of us were interviewed, and they quoted it very nicely. But if you look at the headline, it only talks about science, right? So that's the default part, that's the mainstream part. Everything else is sort of a post hoc. So this is the sort of the third bit here, which is that modelers have infinite ability to modulate their radical interventions, because they can say, okay, I'll change this parameter here so that the effect will not be as bad as you are saying, right? Now, remembering that scientists don't make political decisions, and solar geoengineering is very much entangled in geostrategic security battles around who controls the climate. It's that stuff, right? And so scientists fail to remember, and even if they remember, they don't acknowledge that whatever modeling we are doing, we are not the ones who are going to make decisions. And so if you are a responsible scientist, I'm not asking you to be like morally concerned or anything like that, but if you're a responsible scientist, you ought to understand the empirical reality within which political decisions are made, right? And that empirical reality, I'll just give you one example. So when the idea of forest-based carbon sinks or crop-based carbon sinks was first proposed, the article is from 2001. The idea was proposed in the 90s. David Keith, who used to be at Harvard and is now at Chicago, he wrote this article, and I don't have the quote here. He basically said, it's a good idea, but if it is not done properly, then it can go wrong, right? And he had a very nice article, explaining all the different pros and cons, and he sort of, stopped at that. And then we see that forest-based carbon sequestration actually led to the 2008 hunger crisis. There's World Bank reports, there's all kinds of reports that you can find. I'm not exaggerating. So the scientist said, don't do this the wrong way, it can go really wrong, and then actually went wrong. Then you would think that the scientist would think twice before saying something similar again. But the same scientist, David Keith, now is the main advocate of solar geoengineering, right? So we don't learn from our mistakes, or we don't remember, whichever is the case here. So the other problem with physical scientists is that their data is unmoored from social reality. So I won't go into the details of this table, but the first red column shows that if the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere goes up by 4 times the pre-industrial level of CO2 concentration, then this is how the monsoons are going to change. So India will see 10.2% more monsoon compared to the pre-industrial revolution. North America will see 7% less of precipitation compared to pre-industrial time and so forth, right? Now, if you actually try to do geoengineering that compensates for that 4 times the carbon dioxide concentration, it's going to actually reduce monsoon compared to pre-industrial level by 2.5% over India, right? So addressing the 4-time concentration of carbon dioxide is a good thing, right? And they're going to compare it to the pre-industrial time and say 2.5% monsoon reduction, it's okay, maybe we can live with it. But if you actually compare it to the present reality, that amounts to 12% reduction in monsoons, because it's gone up 10%, it's gone down 2%, right? And so farmers who have been incrementally and cleverly adapting to the changes in precipitation, they are suddenly left with dealing with the shock of 12% change in monsoon. So that's one of the examples to think about how scientific rationality can be pretty narrow and limited in its focus as compared to the farmers' livelihoods who have to deal with very nuanced ways of adapting with the changes in the atmosphere. And it's not that it's just about farmers' lived experiences. There is agroclimatic maps like this one, which shows that there's a great deal of agroclimatic variation. So if you're thinking about doing something like solar geoengineering, you're not going to talk about large, meta-continental size reasons, but you can think about more nuanced ways of understanding how such a scheme will affect the agroclimatic regions. And then, of course, you have a huge diversity of livelihoods that different communities practice. Animal husbandry, farming, agroecology, coffee, you name it, right? And so all of these livelihoods are diverse, complex, nuanced ways of adapting to the environment. And you can't deal with any changes by saying that, don't worry about this, we'll insure you, right? As if you wanted to go to Delhi and try claiming an insurance on your car accident, and you'll know how the crop insurance may or may not work. So this is kind of taken as granted now. I'm coming to almost the end of my comments here. But despite all the critical social science discussions, as I said, within the 8 years that I've been part of this discussion, the climate community has moved from let's talk about this to let's have to do it mode of discussion. And they're already including this in the IPCC reports and other kinds of global climate negotiations. And the last bit is that when social scientists like myself come and say, let's actually think about governance, they often imply, sometimes inadvertently, that as long as we don't sit and we don't produce a bureaucratic document, there's no governance, right? If you think about governance from a political perspective, bringing those discussions onto public domain and then making it part of the ongoing conversations about climate policy, that is governance. You are inserting an idea and legitimizing it by putting it into IPCC documents and United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and so forth. That is default, de facto governance, right? Without actually consulting people. So it becomes a form of undemocratic governance which is being imposed on global community without proper consultation. So this paper kind of talks about that aspect of evolving landscape of climate geoengineering. And finally, even within the last 3 to 4 years, this was in 2021, when we sort of warned about the risks of solar geoengineering research and governance. Within those 2 years after this article came out, the US government was already talking about doing unilateral research of solar geoengineering. And the US government is already putting it into their own national security framework and security establishment, which we can get into if we are talking about. And the very last bit of this is that we, in the justice space, people who talk about inclusion, you know, the 3 aspects of justice, procedural, recognition, and all that stuff, we will say, look, you can't do this on your own. You have to include people. But what does it mean to make madness inclusive? Right? And I mean, you know, and this is a serious philosopher. Femi Taiwo has written a very good book about reparation, but they write this article saying, who are the engineers? The argument being, let's bring in some engineers from the global south. And this is being done. This is being done. Global south scientists are being incentivized to talk about solar geoengineering, and in the process then also legitimize it from the global south perspective, right? Let make madness more inclusive. And so I'll have to conclude here so that we have some time for discussion and Q&A, but we need to think about nuanced ways in which power operates. And so in this power matrix, this was a bunch of years back, we talk about the 3 phases of power, but then we connect them to the global governance and global politics discussion with different levels of exercise of power in terms of the agenda setting, in terms of the narratives and the actual control over resources. And the middle part is really exciting, which talks about the politics of co-optation versus resistance. You know, those 2 things mix together. So there are possibilities where co-optation can be co-opted to resist something, right? And those are the sort of fertile grounds where we have to sort of think about. I'll conclude by saying that us social scientists or critical humanities scholars, we must immediately start collaborating with social movements, indigenous people, and so forth. We will not stop this madness. But who can stop is, you know, social movements and groups that are politically relevant and are able to put some kind of breaks in the system. So one example is the Sami Council, which actually stopped a Harvard experiment on solar geoengineering by saying that you're not going to do this. Because not just because you're doing this in our land and you haven't asked for our permission, but also because we don't agree to this madness. And so they said, in principle, as well as in practice, we are not going to tolerate this kind of madness coming from you. And we talk about some of this in this new book that Zainab was kind enough to mention. Please do order online or pick up copies. I hope you will really enjoy it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. This was so fascinating, and I'm so honored to have, well, the pleasure and the difficult task to try and engage. So I'm gonna offer a few comments, and before I give you the opportunity to maybe get back, I'll open the floor for a first round of questions. That way you can maybe tackle several points, questions at the same time. So again, fascinating, and hearing you, I'm seeing these themes of taming nature, right? Maybe at different levels, from a gentle way, right, through a garden, to really pretty much forcing the sky, right? So first, Professor Ardalan, I have 2 points. If you have maybe some feedback on them, and it's making parallels with Morocco, and I was happy to hear that you're familiar with the country, and also with China. So I'll be going west and east, and in that way also maybe thinking about the future, right? Probably because it's there in the east. So first in the west, so thinking of the comparison between the square and shape of gardens in Iran, in India. And again, I mean, it was so mesmerizing, and this whole conference is really enchanting. But it reminded me of the case of Marrakesh in Morocco, the Agdal gardens, the Menara gardens, and of course there was this Islamic influence that you've talked about. So I was wondering, so here in talking about first Morocco, if we can see something there about how politics are made, right? So looking at domestic politics. So in there, we see that the imperial powers sort of symbolize the form of taming, a gentle taming of nature, right? A refinement, but also you have the practical use, right? The practical use for the orchards, so some form of sustainability, the sort of irrigation, and in arid spaces, so in the case of Morocco. And we went, it seems, from there to like a form of politics that's much more forceful, right? So we think of, for instance, dams, right? Mega dams, right? And even, forcing the skies. So that's one, sort of thinking about how the gardens maybe say something about politics. Then in terms of looking at China, and here we're going maybe back in time a little, so I'm thinking about the notion of Tianxia, right? So the philosophy of we are all under heaven, right? And for instance, the shape of the Temple of Heaven in Beijing, right, where you have the square shape, but this time it's actually not Earth, it's actually Earth, right? And inside Earth, there is the pagoda shape that's a circle, and the pagoda is actually the heaven, right? So I thought it was interesting, and maybe it's actually saying something about a global politics, or I mean, it reflects an idea about order, right? So we are under, but at the same time, maybe instead of a monotheistic thinking of posterity, right? So we have heaven after, right? It seems that we're having heaven inside, encapsulated in the square that is Earth, right? So the pagoda is inside Earth. So Dr. Kashwan, such a timely research, and this is so fascinating. And of course, it's also, I mean, almost maddening, so the craziness to see how much of the policy making on climate change is failing. And it's also it's abandoning the problem, as you say. So it's creating something else instead of dealing with the problem, right? Which is reducing emissions, as you say. So here for asking for feedback, I have 3 quick points. So first on BRICS, greenwashing and militarization. So first, you mentioned how BRICS are not really engaged right now in this policy of climate change, and it seems that they are more concerned about finance. So here, I was wondering how, because we've seen the finance of the green finance as well, right? How solar geoengineering is also maybe doing that, and maybe that could be something that attracts them. If solar geoengineering is subject to north-south disparity inequality, right, in terms of the financing, and who will make money, pretty much, right? Second, so the greenwashing. So I know maybe not everyone likes this term, but I was wondering if you see the solar geoengineering as another form of greenwashing, a new set of extractive capitalist strategies. So creating this new industry of, again, taming the sky, right? How would that look like? Because, for instance, if we think about the electrification of car manufacturing, that's an example of greenwashing, right? So it seems that it's to save the planet, when it's really to save the car industry, right? Lastly, you mentioned in the great paper, so you here talked about security, the securitization, but I think you mentioned militarization with solar geoengineering. So I was wondering how much of this gigantic endeavor of reflecting sunlight, how much of that will take of the perimeter of the sky, right? So if there is maybe a possibility of disturbing civilian aviation, right? Sort of how would that look like, the policing of the sky? Again, thinking about craziness, would there be maybe a market of selling your sky, right? So we've seen the selling of polluting rights, so maybe something like that. Thank you. And maybe we can take a few questions first.
Thanks. I wanted to add to the comment of the discussant, not about the governance and the polluting of the sky, but also the cultural and spiritual perspectives on who owns the sky. Yeah, because I think that is going to be also a very important and potentially contested discussion. Because at the moment, as with the what we call in the ocean space, areas beyond national jurisdiction or ABNJ, that those waters are perceived to be the common heritage of humankind. So, yeah, who owns the sky in the cultural and spiritual senses as well? Thanks.
Yeah, I had a quick question for Prakash, and just wanted to know what you thought of cumulative madness. So there's solar geoengineering. There's also like a similar thing for increasing the alkaline quality of ocean waters at a incredibly similar scales, right? So when all this sort of accumulates, what do you kind of predict? And I just wonder, like, is there a political economy to that you've also been able to unpack, you know?
Thank you so much, Mr. Ardalan and Prakash. This is absolutely fantastic. I loved the paradise and the Firdaus metaphors. And Prakash, I can see a lot of commonalities in terms of going back to the ways that things had been done in the past. But right now, and I want to talk about the elections and the fact that there is, again, a movement towards preserving fossil fuel. Do you think that we are going to ever even see or read about paradise as a thing of the past?
Thank you for sticking around and for those wonderful questions and comments. So I think I should start with Rogea's question about elections and movement to preserve fossil fuels. In fact, this is absolutely the root cause of all of this madness, because once you are able to direct the global community to treat the symptoms, you are, by definition, looking away from looking at the root causes of the problem. And the fossil fuel industry has been preparing for this for 50 years now. The recent evidence that we have is the earliest predictions about the impact of fossil fuel industry on global warming came out in 55, or somewhere around that time. And so it's actually 75 years that the fossil fuel industry has had to do their game. And so climate denial was part of that. Creating a culture of celebrating fossil fuel was part of that. And of course, buying up some of the economists and some kind of think tanks was another part of that. And there's quite a bit of well-documented research on how this was done with archival evidence and so forth. And so that goes back to the sort of same question that Aarti asked about the political economy of cumulative madness. And one book that sort of talks about this particular phenomenon is this book called Climate Leviathan. And it's a very interesting book that combines political economy with political philosophy and political theory. And it says, what can we expect what kind of global responses we can expect to see against climate crisis, given what we know about the political economy of the actual existing communities. And they argue that it's likely that we will see the emergence of a climate leviathan. Leviathan not in terms of a top-down sort of authoritarian single-figure kind of authority, but leviathan that works through the instincts and incentivization of people and authorities and groups and scientists and so forth. And so I would say we are actually seeing the emergence of this kind of a leviathan, which reduces every aspect of climate crisis and the responses to climate crisis to a techno-managerial kind of solution. And so the beauty of those techno-managerial solutions is that they can be capitalized, they can be patented, and they can be controlled towards the singular goal of accumulation of profits in some hands, and then controlling the global community responses to climate in those ways that produce which one maintain the status quo in terms of who benefits and who loses, but then it also maintains a sort of a security apparatus that controls different parts of globe. And then it gets to, one part of climate leviathan then gets into some old discussions about global surveillance and controlling of population in certain places so that we can maintain a global balance, right? So this, I hope, it gives you some idea of how extensive this is going to be in terms of the kind of surveillance, kind of controls, and the kind of technocratic responses that we are going to see in the times to come.
If we deal with the areas that I had presented, although you must know, I have been a sustainable architect for 50 years, and I've dealt extensively. I've written books that were presented at the first UN Environmental Conference in 1976. So that's a pedigree. If we deal with the areas that I had presented, although you must know, I have been a sustainable architect for 50 years, and I've dealt extensively. I've written books that were presented at the first UN Environmental Conference in 1976. So that's a pedigree. But what I've learned is not something that you can write down as a prescription. It's an attitude. It's an attitude of the relationship of human beings to nature. And the attitude is very simple. Are you a part of nature? Are you a part of existence? So this is part that takes you to an interpretation of how did it all begin, right? Who came first? If there is a belief system that there is an order in the universe, such as what James wrote about, and people like Coleridge and all the environmentalists in the 19th century wrote about, if there's an attitude that we're an integral part of nature, and in fact, I have to go a little bit to an example of how such a thing was answered. I refer you to the writings of Ibn Arabi, 13th century mystical philosopher, but probably considered a very interesting interpreter of parts of the Quran. He deals with the aspect that God was a hidden treasure and wished to be known. Therefore, he created existence. And existence is an aspect of the absolute, the access of the divine, however you wish to name the unnamed. To come to know itself, listen to this, if It was a hidden treasure that wished to know itself. Therefore, it created existence. Therefore, we are all aspects of that unknown treasure coming to know ourselves in this process of the absolute coming to know itself. Therefore, the attitude is of integral. We're all aspects of the same soul. So this business of man over nature or man and nature is an absurd question from that point of view. You are an integral part of that existence. Now, for many years, really until most recently, when we became this material-driven determinism, empiricist attitude, life existed as you being a part of nature. And so, for instance, these 7,000 years of history of the Persian Gulf, of these cities that we investigated, in many, many aspects that I had shown, they lived and created as though you were using nature to benefit nature. You were not dominating it. You were not in conflict with nature. I think that's the attitude of where we are at this dilemma. And I very much agree that all these techniques to try to manipulate this problem are doomed because they deal with it at too small a scale. It has to be a very broad scale. Now, it isn't very long. It's only really about 200 years or so that we became empiricists. Yes, of course, in the Greek there were the empiricists and then there were the Platonics, yes, but this had been a dialogue. Today, we're completely dominated by the fact that we, through technique, will survive. And it's a fallacy. So I'm so glad that we had this kind of presentation by my colleague. And I have been dealing with this as an architect, trying to build cities and homes. And I think the only way that I can do and talk about it is sensitivity, a very refined sensitivity. And now I ask, and more or less conclude this little contribution by asking you a question. Which came first, consciousness or man? Is it Descartes, je pense donc que je suis, I think therefore I am? Or no, is it consciousness that allowed you to ask such a question? It's very fundamental about these things. It's a mystery. And we're all part of this mystery, looking for answers. And so we have to be very open to each other because we're all searchers.
If nobody else wants to ask a question, I would like to ask you as somebody who actually worked. Thank you so much. So as somebody on the steering committee for the Aga Khan Awards for Sustainable Architecture, I remember some place in Saudi Arabia, if I am correct, if my memory serves, what did they do right? The other thing I wanted to ask you, given your experience of building throughout, what was your most challenging or what were the opportunities for you to build sustainably?
Did we set up this question? It so happens that I'm directing a world competition, design competition, in how to design transcendent creations. What does that mean? Transcendent. And I love this word in a way because you used it here, and I don't know how exactly you use it, you use the word liminal. It's the between. I use examples of barzak. Ibn Arabi describes barzak because when I said this to my wife, she said, yeah, but that means you're in purgatory. Barzak is, you're waiting, you die, you're waiting to see if you were good or bad, to hell or to heaven. That's not, no. What it is, it's the transition. It's the transition between states. Yeah, between being phenomenal or angelic. Angels are liminal. They're transition beings between physical and non-physical and transcendent. And so, if you ask me what's the challenge, how can you design transcendence into what we build? In our home, in our garden, in our city, in our country, because it's a level of consciousness which is not today the rule of the challenge. It isn't what we teach in schools of architecture. Believe me, I've been the critic of design at these schools that this lovely lady described. Nobody deals with spirituality and architecture, except that there is a group, it's a very small group, and we're just launching in March of this coming year, this world competition, and we're trying to develop consciousness. And where do we want to hold the ceremonies? We want to build the ceremonies and hold these ceremonies about who can build transcendence in in the epitome of materialism, which is Dubai. That is in the very Sin City. We want to talk about this subject because it's about time. It's about time because we've taken it all that this is what you should do. So the Dubai syndrome, which now spreads through every country, they want to build a little Dubai. You built 1,100 meter. No, I want 2,000 meter. And so in Saudi Arabia, they're building this longest wall. It's caught our imagination to build unsustainably, but that it has an image. Sunyata, nothingness. How can you build nothingness? Because we come from nothingness, we go to nothingness, and in between, we think we're somethingness. And that's an illusion.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This was great.